You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Kevin Grier of the University of Oklahoma. Kevin, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Hi, Garrett. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
So our topic for today is a paper you wrote on the economic consequences of Hugo Chavez. I had Francisco Toro on the show last year to discuss Venezuela's economic history, and I'll link to that episode in the show notes for this episode. So what's really interesting about your paper is the empirical method you use to quantify Chavez's effect on Venezuela. So what I'm hoping we can do for this episode is talk a little bit about Chavez, we'll frame the question we're trying to answer, and then we'll just walk listeners through the synthetic control method you use in the paper. So let's start with the background. Tell me about Hugo Chavez and the debate over his economic policies.
Well, sure, Garrett. And I should just mention that this paper is co-authored with Norman Maynard, who's an assistant professor at the College of Charleston in South Carolina. But Hugo Chavez was a military officer. He tried to gain power in 1992 by starting a coup in Venezuela. He failed. He was put in prison. He was pardoned in 1994 by the president of the country at the time. And in the 1998 general election, he was considered a fringe candidate, a very unserious candidate in the beginning of the election campaign. But by the summer, he had become the frontrunner, was immensely popular, and won the election easily, and took office in 1999. And in 1999, he started a constitutional assembly. He created a new constitution for the country. He converted the legislature from bicameral to unicameral. He allowed for re-election of the president, increased the length of presidential terms, just really changed the political institutions of the country of Venezuela in a very fast manner.
Right. And he was a avowed socialist. So a lot of his policies were creating workers, collectives, and nationalizing certain key industries, things we associate with socialism.
Yeah, I think that happened more and more as time went on. I mean, again, I'm not a political scientist, so I don't want to sort of overstep my bounds here and try to stay in my lane. But at least at the beginning, from my reading of the history and my reading of what was going on, Chavez was really pushing and became popular because he was pushing that the elites have governed this country for too long. They've governed against the interest of the masses. So he launched the Bolivarian Revolution after his hero, Simon Bolivar. And a lot of what was in the new constitution was indigenous people's rights, as you were saying, workers' rights, social justice, increased access to healthcare and education, and things like that. The nationalizations and things like that more happened piecemeal over time as he sort of consolidated power and became sort of more autocratic and stranger as a national leader.
Yeah, so he is sort of seen. We have a lot of debates about Chavez, elsewhere in the world because he's this polarizing figure, and a lot of what he's doing or what he did and what his successor Maduro is currently doing are things that some camps think should be a model for development in other countries, or even a model for already wealthy countries, and others on the more liberal side, liberal as in liberal economics, think that maybe not so much. Maybe a lot of these policies have unintended consequences. Maybe they don't do exactly what they're supposed to do or what we want them to do.
Sure.
Yeah, so that's the controversy. It's very much a left-right thing, although it's hard to fit any one leader perfectly to any one sort of ideological label.
What was interesting to us from our point of view of doing the paper was that you could see, and this paper was written before current events and sort of the disintegration of Venezuela under Maduro and just the chaos that has sort of descended into at this point. But what was interesting to us at the time, Chavez was considered successful by a lot of people. Would say his policies were successful, that Venezuela was, showing a new way to do things, that he was, helping his people, the common people, and, that it was a success. And on the other side, there were people saying, this is horrible, this doesn't work, it's not working. So Chavez is viewed by a big group of people, at the time we were writing the paper, at least as a hero, and by another group of people, as an autocrat and as a failure. And all that comes down to, the question that you can't see, and that is, what would have happened in Venezuela if they'd have stuck with business as usual and hadn't changed their political institutions and hadn't granted so much power to this one person. So it's kind of easy when you only have one case to talk about, and we see this a lot in economics and in politics, especially in macroeconomics where there's not a huge amount of data. We can make arguments where we sort of cherry pick our counterfactual. You see in macroeconomics, you'll see people saying things like, well, taxes don't matter because tax rates were higher under Clinton than they were under Bush, and growth was better under Clinton than under Bush. And so that's their proof, right? And they've just cherry-picked the counterfactual there that the only thing different between the Clinton years and the Bush years was the marginal tax rate, which is, sort of silly.
Yeah.
And you see people all the time in these policy areas just cherry-picking their counterfactual to try to make their case. So two groups of people with different ideologies or different beliefs, can look at the same historical episode and come to opposite conclusions because their counterfactual, whether it's explicit or implicit, what would have happened without the thing, allows them to, by choosing that strategically or choosing that emotionally or however they do it, it allows them to make claims, either side making opposite claims from the same experience. And that's kind of what we saw in the case of Venezuela. And we thought maybe we can try to bring some objectivity to the counterfactual, a little more sort of impartiality, a little bit more rigor, a little bit more systematic construction of the counterfactual, and get a more objective answer to the performance of Venezuela under Chavez.
So if this were the old days and I wanted to do just what you said, sort of implicitly build a counterfactual for Venezuela, what I might do is take my variable of interest, say real GDP per capita, and then throw it into a linear regression with, some controls and a dummy variable for when Chavez takes power. So a variable that's a 0 up to 1999 and then a 1 thereafter. What would be the pitfalls of using that method?
Okay, so you mean a time series regression just of Venezuela?
Yeah.
With a dummy variable for the time period. Okay, so that would be called like before and after. And we're saying that the counterfactual for what would have happened without Chavez is just extrapolating from the past, essentially.
Yeah, but you have variables like the oil price, right? So
Sure.
Hopefully you can control for some of the mitigating factors.
Sure. So that is certainly a possibility of how to do it. Again, it assumes that that dummy variable in 1999 and Chavez coming in there is the only thing that's going on. The other things that are a little bit problematic with regression, to me, the biggest thing that's problematic about regression is that you can often end up with your counterfactual extrapolating outside of the experience of the data that you're using to estimate the model. So what I mean by that is if you think about estimating an equation, you can have positive weights on some variables, negative weights on other variables, and your predicted value, say, for Venezuela's per capita income in 2003 after Chavez, is some extrapolation out of that past data that's way outside of what we would call the support of the data. That is, it's way outside of the historical experience that we use to estimate the model to begin with. Right. And we're sort of worried about that as a problem because we have no idea of what the correct functional form of our regression really is. We use linearity, or log linearity from tradition, convenience, tractability. And we think that maybe, in the area near the experience of the data that things are approximately linear and we're happy with that. But then we end up, when we end up making counterfactual predictions, often we're taking that linear approximation and projecting it out beyond the support of the data in an extrapolation that is unlikely to really be very accurate.
Yeah, so if in that case, we're resting a lot on the idea that the Venezuelan economy, from say 1970 to 1999 is a lot like the Venezuelan economy from 1999 to 2013 or something.
Right.
Yeah, just with this one thing change that we have Chavez now and we didn't before. And we can throw in some regressors, oil prices being very important and things like that. But there's also a worry that we'll miss something, right? And that something will be correlated with our variable of interest and it'll throw off our result.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So,
for sure.
A more modern technique would be to use something like differences in differences. So if we could say find another country that was a lot like Venezuela, and then what we could do is look at how the two countries were trending and how things were going before 1999, and then whether the trends were different after 1999. And then we look at the difference in those differences, or the Diff-in-diff, as it's called. So let's talk about that. What if I did that and say took Columbia, which is right next door? How would that work?
Okay, so I mean, synthetic control, which we're going to end up talking about, does have some elements of a difference in difference kind of approach to it. So I don't mean to say that Diff-in-diff is a bad idea at all. I've written papers using it, and it is a nice way to try to deal with selection bias and to try to deal with unobservable factors that might both be influencing the performance of the economy and the fact that the treatment of Chavez is happening. So Diff-in-diff is not a bad first step or a bad way to think about doing it. The idea, again, just to sort of repeat what you're saying, is we'd look at, what's the difference in GDPs between Colombia and Venezuela before Chavez, what's the difference after Chavez, and the difference of those two differences would give us our treatment effect of Chavez. And that's, not a terrible idea, I guess. In some sense, the problem there, again, comes down to who's the control or what's the counterfactual. In Diff-in-diff, the counterfactual essentially is that the gap between those two countries in the absence of the treatment would stay the same. We call that the parallel trends assumption. So in Diff-in-diff, we're worried about sort of time-varying unobservables, or even time-varying observable factors that we're not controlling for, that might cause those trends, absent the treatment, to differ. The other issue, I think, with Diff-in-diff is picking the control, right? You mentioned Colombia. Mm-hmm. And so Colombia would be a good choice if the Colombian economy was very similar to the Venezuelan economy, that they had the same trading partners, maybe if they had a common currency or they had a fixed exchange rate between them, or, things like that made them economically similar. Then this idea that we would have parallel trends might well be correct in some sense. So you could think of maybe what the problem with Diff-in-diff is, in some sense, is picking who the control group is.
Yeah, and I mean, the great thing about Diff-in-diff is it's so intuitive, right? And you say you
Sure.
can, if you have this, something that makes sense as a control, you might see like an article in Vox or something where they say, this thing happened, here's what it was like before, here's what it was like after. But in order to say what the effect of the thing was, hey, let's look at this other group or this other thing where it didn't happen. And you see this informally in a lot of arguments where people will say like, hey, look at East and West Germany or North and South Korea. Implicitly, they're making a sort of Diff-in-diff argument there where it's like, okay, these things were very plausibly the same before. They were part of the same country. And then they divided them up and imposed different institutions, and look how they changed. So it's great. It aligns with the way we really think about the world, but it really depends on having something relevant to compare to.
Yes.
Yeah, and
so I completely agree with that.
And in your paper, you show that the best comparisons for Venezuela leading up to 1999 are Argentina in Latin America and Iran, which, relevant because it's an OPEC country, and Venezuela they both depend on oil exports for a lot of their economy. But really, neither of those is a really good comparison. So tell me about synthetic control now. How do you get around not having another country that's really similar to Venezuela?
Sure, that's a great question. So just the sort of from a case study approach, people will pick a control. They won't often talk about it in Diff-in-diff terms, like, in like political science and things like that. But you're right, they're intuitively doing a Diff-in-diff, right? They're saying, here's our control country to compare our case study to. Let's pick Colombia for Venezuela, or let's take, in our paper we show, let's take an average of all Latin American countries, or let's take an average of all OPEC countries. Because we say those are the two salient factors about Venezuela, right? It's a Spanish-speaking country in South America, and it's a member of OPEC. So neither one of those track Venezuela before Chavez very well at all. And then if we picked a particular single country, as you mentioned, Argentina is the closest to best fitting single Latin American country. It doesn't fit that great around the best fitting OPEC country, but again, not so great. So the idea of synthetic control is to try to create, go to the lab and cook up a manufactured or a synthetic counterfactual or control group or control unit for Venezuela. And we kind of have two objectives in doing that. We want our synthetic, our constructed fake Venezuela or synthetic Venezuela, we want it to quote unquote look like Venezuela. We want it to have like sort of the same education level, the same rates of inflation, or the same levels of investment, or things like that. And we want it to track Venezuela's performance as close as possible before the intervention, before Chavez. So we have data from 1970 through 1998, so 29 years of data on Venezuela and on these other Latin American OPEC countries. And we're trying to find some weighted average of these individual countries that looks like Venezuela on its covariates or on its indicator variables and tracks Venezuela closely before 1999, before Chavez. Okay, that's the intuition of what synthetic control is. We want to find a counterfactual that, in a way it's like matching, that we want to find, for our treated U, we want to find a matched control that looks like it. But here, we're not matching it with just one other country. We're matching it with some weighted average of these potential donor countries.
Yeah, and I've got the table in your paper up in front of me. So we may not have a country that looks just like Venezuela in terms of income up to 1999, but if you take 15% Canada and 43% Iran and 32% Mexico and 9% Peru, you get pretty close. You get something that looks just like Venezuela, at least in terms of income per capita. And that's pretty good. What you're capturing there with the big percentage on Iran, you're capturing the effect of oil shocks. Also Canada, with the weight on Mexico, you're maybe capturing some more regional shocks, and Peru. So it's intuitively, it seems like, okay, you mix those countries together in a pot and you get something that looks a little like Venezuela.
Right. That's exactly the idea. And mixing them in the pot, we use sort of linear programming to try to get the synthetic control because we're giving it two different objectives, match on these indicator variables and track the performance of Venezuela. And so we'd sort of do that iteratively. And we're actually able to get a synthetic control that the prediction error, the root mean square, the percentage root mean squared error, which is a common measure of lack of fit in forecasting, is under 7%. So, we're predicting Venezuela's movements pretty well, and we're matching the indicator variables decently, at least, on outcomes. So the population growth is similar, openness to trade is similar, educational levels are similar in our constructed Venezuela and in actual Venezuela.
Yeah, so with the indicator variables, if we took those weights that I mentioned, 43% Iran and weights of other things, you'd get a pretty similar number of years of education and these other things we're interested in. So someone couldn't come and complain and say, your synthetic Iran, your synthetic Venezuela is way more educated than the real Venezuela, and maybe there was some shock that made education more valuable. So they can't come at you with that criticism.
Exactly. So this is in like propensity score matching. This is a really big deal about covariate balance, where you want your matched control group and your treated group to be the same or not have significant differences across a bunch of different indicator variables or covariates. So we're doing it a little more informally in synthetic control, but yes, that's a way to try to show credibility for the synthetic that you've created, that it is a valid counterfactual, because it could fit good because of interpolation or luck or whatever. But if we can also show that we match on these indicator variables, that gives more credibility to the fact that we do have something that really is, looks like Venezuela and acts like Venezuela.
Yeah.
So if it looks like Venezuela and it talks like Venezuela, then I guess maybe we can say it is, our counterfactual for Venezuela.
Yeah, and it's convincing that it's not just a coincidence, right? That things aren't just tracking each other for sort of spurious reasons. It really is that they have similar economies in different aspects. So in the oil exporting or in the region-related things, and education and openness and all these things.
Right. And that's something that the professor from Harvard, Alberto Abadi, who sort of invented or co-invented this technique, that he really stresses is that one thing you want to be sure of when you're doing this kind of approach is you want to make your potential donor countries, or the countries that could potentially form the synthetic control, that they need to be, all of them, plausibly similar to Venezuela, to your treated unit, in my case, Venezuela. So we didn't use all the countries in the world, right? We didn't use countries from Asia. We didn't use countries from, well, we did use OPEC countries from Africa, right? Nigeria is in there. But we didn't just use countries from sub-Saharan Africa. We didn't just, use rich European countries. There are some European countries in the potential set of donors, but they're energy exporters, which we thought was reasonable. So we looked at the world and we tried to find middle to upper income Latin American countries or middle to upper income energy exporting countries, and those comprised our donor pool, our potential set of units that we could use to create our synthetic Venezuela. Right. And Abadi emphasizes that extremely, and especially in the last paper that he's written on the topic that was published in the American Political Science Review. He emphasizes that that's important to do for credibility reasons and for making sure, that you're just not taking a super rich country and a super poor country and getting lucky with an average of those two in a way that's creating a very uncredible counterfactual.
Right. Yeah. If you include enough countries or, just enough time series, maybe you could build a model where you say, okay, the per capita GDP of Venezuela is the average of, it's the average of like
Luxembourg and the Chad, or something like that. That would make no sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's no plausible reason why it would be that way. And there's a lot of countries in the world, and therefore a lot of different GDP per capita time series, and you could very well overfit a model by putting too much in it.
Exactly. This is open for debate in the literature now. I mean, when we wrote this paper, we had referees essentially criticizing us for not using every possible country in the world and for being like selective in our choice of countries. And luckily for us, while we were revising the paper, Abadi's piece in the APSR became available. And, I just sent that piece to the editor and said, look, all due respect to the referee, I think that, this is the way to go. And so, I mean, that idea of the perils of overfitting and what is the choice of potential donor countries is something that's still being contested somewhat in the literature.
Okay. So, I guess to emphasize to listeners is that this is all really new. So Abadi's original synthetic control paper, where he made a synthetic Basque country to look at the effects of terrorism, that's just 2003. So, a lot of the time talking about economics, you're talking about things that might date back to the 60s, at least in terms of a lot of economic theory, or we talk about stuff going back a long way, but this is very much the cutting edge. This is the kind of stuff that people are writing their dissertations on right now, and I know people who are.
Yeah, it hasn't made it into the textbooks yet, that's for sure. It's like, it's not in mostly harmless econometrics, sort of the Bible of applied microeconometrics and stuff. So yeah, you're right.
And if you study it, you probably wouldn't encounter it until your PhD, maybe a master's, if you were in a very good master's program. Yeah, so it's cutting edge. So let's go through your actual results, the results of your synthetic control. I feel like we've been teasing it so much that we have to say, what did happen to Venezuela under Hugo Chavez?
Sure. So we'll start with, I guess, sort of the thing we start with in the paper, and the thing we've been discussing as the outcome variable, which is per capita income. And we find that actual Venezuela just dramatically outperformed the synthetic counterfactual during the first 11 years of the Chavez era. Yeah, go ahead, Garrett,
the other way around, right? The synthetic Venezuela outperformed, right?
Oh, did I say it back? Yes, sorry. Yes, that the actual Venezuelan economy dramatically underperformed. Yes. Thank you for the correction. Dramatically underperformed its synthetic control. So the way we think about that is, right, the synthetic control matched Venezuela very closely up until 1999. Our root mean squared error was less than 7%. After 1999, synthetic Venezuela shows pretty rapid growth. And the main reason for that is because in the early 2000s, oil prices grew dramatically. Oil prices went from in the low $30 a barrel range to well over $100 a barrel in this period. So, when you've got 42% Iran and you've got Mexico, who's an oil exporter, when that's in your synthetic, those countries do well. And synthetic Venezuela, which tracked actual Venezuela great up until 1999, takes off. And actual Venezuela does not take off at all. And we find by the end of we shut down our experiment in 2009 after 10 years of Chavez, we find that Venezuela is almost 25% poorer than the synthetic control indicates it should be. So even though Venezuela is richer in 2010 than it was in 1998, so you could say, well, there was growth under Chavez, the synthetic control method is saying that Venezuela missed a huge opportunity to get a lot richer.
Right. So it drops precipitously for the first few years, real Venezuela. Then it climbs up, catches up. It's sort of after that point, it matches the trend of the synthetic Venezuela, but it's catching up from being far behind. Whereas synthetic Venezuela doesn't have the deep fall in per capita GDP, and it just grows, and it's quite a bit richer. And yeah, if we didn't have our synthetic Venezuela, it'd be really hard to say, okay, yeah, they had a recession, but they grew out of it. But that difference is very striking. So then some of the other things, maybe Chavez doesn't care so much about per capita GDP. There are a lot of other important things that matter that aren't necessarily captured in GDP, like health or inequality or poverty. So let's talk about those.
Sure. And I think that's sort of tooting my own horn here, but I think that's one of the nice things about our paper. An interesting thing about our paper is we wanted to have like a multi-dimensional evaluation of Chavismo, of Chavez's performance of the Venezuelan country under his rule. And, economists were focused, and, rightly so, focused on per capita GDP as a measure of wealth and things like that. But Chavez explicitly said, that we want to increase better health outcomes. We want to reduce inequality. We want to reduce poverty and things like that. So we thought it was fair to sort of take this same method and apply it to these other criterion and see what we could get. So we started with health, and we picked two indicators of health: infant mortality and life expectancy. And if you look at the raw data, you can see that infant mortality fell, pretty much unabatedly fell every year from 1999 through 2010, through the end of when we studied the Venezuelan economy. And life expectancy grew pretty much unabatedly every year from 1999 to 2010 when we studied. And again, you will see people say the Chavez administration was great for public health, it reduced infant mortality, and they attribute that reduction to actions undertaken by Chavez's administration. And the synthetic counterfactual method is trying to say what would have happened to life expectancy or infant mortality without Chavez. Right? So we do the same thing. We estimate a synthetic Venezuela. We get what its prediction of life expectancy and its prediction for infant mortality would be. We see that pre-1990 time, the two things fit actual Venezuela incredibly well. And they pretty much perfectly predict the decline in infant mortality and the increase in life expectancy that we see. So our takeaway from that is that while we can attribute a big subpar performance in GDP per capita to Chavez because it differs from the synthetic control, the decline in infant mortality and the increase in life expectancy are not reasonably attributed to Chavez-specific things because they're perfectly predicted by our synthetic control, which we developed using pre-Chavez Venezuelan data.
Right.
And it's even, in some sense, it's even simpler than that. If you just look at, you were talking about before and after. If you just look at actual Venezuela before and after Chavez, you see that the Chavez data is just continuing a trend that's been going on since at least 1970. Life expectancy had been rising and infant mortality had been falling in Venezuela. At least, we just started in the 1970s, the earliest we have data, but at least since 1970.
Right.
So there's really nothing to credibly say we should credit the Chavez administration with these improvements in public health.
Right. And we should mention that your control countries, the weights you put on them are different for each outcome variable. So for infant mortality, there's a lot of weight put on Panama and Norway. And for life expectancy, there's most of the weight, 83.7 or 83.8% put on Argentina. So
right.
It's not necessarily the same countries that were in the economic analysis that track Venezuela
Correct.
In terms of its health outcomes.
And one thing we've been thinking about trying to do perhaps in the future is to, instead of creating the synthetic just on one outcome, is to try to create like a multidimensional synthetic that wouldn't necessarily change from outcome to outcome. In other words, try to track all the indicators at once with a single synthetic. that's not out in the literature at all. I would need a co-author that's better at linear programming than me to try to work on that. But I do think that's something that would be interesting to see is can you get one synthetic with one set of weights that will work for a variety of outcomes. But that's definitely not what we do. We treat each outcome as a new case and create a new synthetic for each outcome.
Yeah, having all one, it would be nice because it would capture sort of our intuition that health and wealth and all these things are related. And so maybe tackling them all separately and putting very different weights on the countries is not as satisfying as having one unified sort of model or construction that mimics all these things. So the next thing you look at is the poverty rate. And, Chavez directed at least his rhetoric and a lot of his policies at helping the poor. So how did he do?
So poverty does fall. And by poverty measure, we use the percent of the population below $5 a day as our poverty measure, because we were creating a synthetic from other countries, and countries' national poverty lines differ. So we're using that sort of World Bank poverty line. And, the famous one is $1 a day, but, Venezuela is just way richer than that. There may well be now, but at least at the time period of our study, there just was not much action in the under $1 a day. So we chose percent of the population below $5 a day in Venezuela. And we have fewer control countries because this data is a little bit more spotty. We don't necessarily have it for every year, so the graphs aren't as pretty. But poverty under Chavez initially grew. You can see that when we look at the synthetic Venezuela for GDP, you see that big fall in GDP. That's going to, be directly correlated with the rise in poverty early in the Chavez administration. And then as GDP rises in real Venezuela, we can see that actual poverty is falling in the later part of the sample. But that fall, again, is showing up in synthetic Venezuela as well. At the end of our estimations here, actual Venezuela and synthetic Venezuela are sitting right at the same level of poverty. So there is a reduction of poverty after the initial surge from the horrible economic performance at the beginning of Chavez's administration. But the synthetic is predicting that fall, and we don't see any difference between actual poverty and predicted poverty from the synthetic Venezuela.
Right. So although the country as a whole was poorer on average, it did not translate into more people falling below that $5 a day threshold. So in some sense, this is weakly a success.
Sure. It underperformed its synthetic on income, but at least it didn't underperform its synthetic on poverty, would be another way to say what you're saying, I think. And that's true.
And it makes sense with a lot of these interventions being directed at the poor. So related is inequality. How did that do?
So again, before we talk about that, I have to give a disclaimer here. Like, international comparisons of inequality is a statistically and theoretically fraught exercise. Countries don't construct exactly the same kind of surveys. Some are cities, some are rural, some are national, some are not. So you kind of have to build up your courage and hold your nose and jump in there and do the best that you can with cross-national comparisons of inequality. And we use the Gini coefficient as our measure of inequality. So with that caveat said, we used the raw data and constructed our own measures, cross-country measures, and we used this SWIID database that was done by a political scientist, Frederick Solt. The two results come out pretty much the same, so we're happy with that. We're not happy that our synthetic Venezuela is not as volatile as actual Venezuela pre-Chavez. Mm-hmm. And here is probably, when we get to the actual, after all the caveats, when we get to the outcomes, we do tend to see that Venezuela reduced inequality more than would be predicted by synthetic Venezuela. The difference is not really statistically significant, but we do see a pretty decent sized gap there that inequality falls faster under Chavez than is predicted by the synthetic.
Yeah, and that fits with looking at poverty as well. If you have lower income but unchanged poverty, it means that at least in the bottom tail of the income distribution, the bottom tail is doing better than the median, right?
Relatively, yes.
Yeah.
We sort of indulge in a little bit of snarkiness there. We say that if poverty is unchanged and income has gone down and inequality has gone down, it means we're reducing inequality not by raising up the poor, but by sort of hurting the upper part of the distribution.
Yeah, so I think the philosophers call that downward egalitarianism or something of that
Okay.
sort, where you can make everyone equal by breaking all their knees, and now I'm exactly as fast as Usain Bolt because neither of us can walk. Yeah, it's sort of, when we talk about inequality, there's always that sort of undesirable implication of caring too much about inequality that you could get this outcome that is clearly worse for everyone. And
yeah, sure.
Yeah, and
sure. As an economist, I would prefer to see inequality unchanged and poverty below $5 a day falling. To me, that would be a much better social outcome than poverty is unchanged, but inequality is less.
Yeah, I guess it's not something that, I don't know. I feel like a lot of the debate on inequality tends to conflate it with poverty. And then when you get more sophisticated people talking about inequality, like Joseph Stiglitz or, smart people with Nobel Prizes, they have to sort of go to sort of elaborate arguments to justify caring about inequality, like, oh, it'll create an inequality in political power or unrest or things like that.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, here we have a society that's autocratic, and so there's a lot of inequality in political power, and despite falling inequality in terms of just wealth.
Right.
So that's our look at Chavez, and he doesn't look particularly good in that light. But the nice thing is that here we can remove the other factors that contributed to all those changes in variables. So oil prices were shooting up during the early part of his regime, and after he died and also after this paper came out in the fourth quarter of 2014, oil prices crashed back down again, and Venezuela just collapsed.
Living in Oklahoma, believe me, I'm well aware of the decline in oil prices. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, it's pretty bad in Canada, too, because, we have all the oil in Alberta, and the value of our dollar actually tracks the oil price really closely. And so all my online shopping since 2015 has been just much more expensive. Quite frustrating. But it's more, I'm sure it's more frustrating if you live in Venezuela and you can't get food. So the sort of, takeaway we might take from it is that Venezuela looked like it was doing okay under Chavez and later Maduro, but a lot of that was just, they got lucky. They have just a ton of oil. I think more proven oil reserves than any other country. I think they recently passed Saudi Arabia on that, or if not, they're very close. And you can use the revenue from having, booming oil prices and your very productive oil industry to smooth over the other weaknesses in your economy, which all sort of came to a head when the oil money wasn't there anymore. And
I think that's a fair assessment. I think that boom in oil prices sort of saved Chavez, right, from facing the consequences of the policies that he had undertaken, and the weakening in their democracy score, and their weakening in their investment climate and all that kind of stuff, and the inattention to the maintenance and exploration and just maintaining their national oil industry during that period. I think those rising oil prices papered over a lot of things that were not being done very well. And as you said, when the oil price came down, then those problems became just horribly, tragically apparent for the people that lived there, for sure.
Yeah, and other countries like Canada and like, Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing countries, they've got it bad. The oil price fell and that wasn't good for them, but we're still feeding ourselves, right? We're more diversified. We have other functioning sectors of the economy that can take up the slack when oil is cheap. None of these countries is perfect, but the difference between all the other oil-producing countries and Venezuela is so dramatic since 2014 that I think it can't be denied that their economy is basically dysfunctional.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I wouldn't want to tout the Saudi Arabian economy as some kind of model that people should try to follow, but they certainly haven't had this level of problems, for sure.
Mm-hmm. So let's just talk a little bit about synthetic controls. We mentioned Abadi and building a synthetic Basque country. I'm seeing it used all over the place now. And the great thing is I never really trusted regression. There's a linear regression and it controls for variables and has some result. I'm always sort of, yeah, but what about this other thing? They didn't control for this different thing. And I'm just not so sure about that result. But The great thing about the new proliferation of these results from synthetic control is that I basically trust them if they're well done and if they build a good control that tracks whatever we're looking at fairly well before change, then
Right.
I'm pretty willing to say, yeah, that's a valid counterfactual. So recently, for instance, I read someone did a synthetic control for Seattle's minimum wage. They looked at, Seattle versus a control constructed from the nearby zip codes. And they showed, as with theory, that although the economy is growing and Seattle, and so there's more employment, there's less overall employment and fewer hours for minimum wage workers in Seattle than in this control.
Right. And see, that's a great case to me where synthetic control is really valuable because you have, the advocates for higher minimum wages saying, look, they raised it and look, the sky hasn't fallen. People are still working. The local economy is growing. So minimum wages don't matter, right? And that's just, not logical thinking, right? Because the question is what would have happened in the absence of putting these regulations in place? And synthetic control is a great way to get at that, right? To make the counterfactual more realistic. So yeah, I think that's a tremendous application.
And in terms of some other applications I'm seeing recently, so I have a friend named Eric Adebayo, who's also a co-author of mine. He's constructing a synthetic Alabama to see the effects of their immigration laws. They have these laws where police can check your immigration status, at traffic stops and stuff. And his results are preliminary, but is basically showing that this is chasing away legal migrants born outside the U.S. as well, because it's basically sort of statewide harassment of people from other countries. So yeah, just, there's all sorts of uses for this. Do you have any favorites?
Well, I've seen, I just recently refereed a paper that was using synthetic control to look at the effect of right-to-work laws in several states. Oklahoma is a state where it's been in place long enough that there's a post-right-to-work law period. So there's a bunch of states that always had it, and you can't really do much with them because there's no pre-intervention. There's a bunch of states that have just recently enacted these laws, and you don't have much post-intervention period. But there's 5 or 6 states where there's a decent amount of time on either side of the intervention. And this paper was constructing like synthetic states and looking to see what effect these right-to-work laws had on employment growth and on output growth. And wasn't finding very much. I thought the paper was well done. I gave it a revise and resubmit in the journal. I don't know the author. It was anonymous. But they were not finding big employment effects of enacting right-to-work law.
Yeah.
But I thought that was a nice application of the technique as well.
Yeah, it's so interesting because so much of the time you feel like you sort of different sides of the political spectrum arguing with each other, and they reference their own studies and analysis, and there's so many different ways you could do things. But here we have a method that, all sides more or less agree on, and it's giving us results that are interesting and robust. And yeah, it's just really interesting. We live in exciting times for nerds, I guess.
There's never been a better time to be a nerd. I totally agree with that.
Yeah. My guest today has been Kevin Grier. Kevin, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks. Thank you. I really enjoyed it.